All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. Not much news to discuss today. It's been really slow recently in the news cycle, so I figured what better to do than to do a video that I've been wanting to do for a couple months at this point, and let's discuss the 5 books that have shaped the way I think the most. Basically, we'll be going through 5 different books, and they range in topics from economics to foreign policy to the right wing in general, and it shapes the way that I view things and the way that I react in these videos to the news of the day. And I think it's important to go over this so that from this point forward, you have a true understanding of how I see the world and why I react to the news in the way that I do. So we'll discuss all that and more today on the Quest for Clarity podcast.
Americanism, not globalism.
I am not a slave. I am a free citizen.
There should be no Federal Reserve system.
Only America first.
End all of these wars. America is trying to play empire. We want everything released, and you're actively covering it up. It's not America first to be pushing our influence in areas where it shouldn't be. We're run by people that don't understand what they're doing and don't understand the ramifications of the policies they're enacting. That's an incredibly dangerous situation. All right, so before we start, if you wouldn't mind going down below and liking and subscribing on this video, I really would appreciate it. Also, if you could go over to my X, Instagram, and Spotify, I would really appreciate it. It helps me out a lot if you could give a follow to the accounts over there. But let's get into this. So I think it's before we get into all the individual books, which I have 5 right here next to me to show you guys, I think it's important to set the frameworks for what I would consider myself in terms of my worldview. If I had to put a label on myself, I would consider myself a conservative libertarian, which is still a broad label because there's many strands within those labels. And I would consider, based on these 5 books, the points that I'm going to cover today are the economy, of which I have the view of a capitalist, free market capitalist, war, which my view on war is that I'm pretty much anti-war, and kind of the right wing in general, to which there's different strands of the right wing. There's the more libertarian right wing. There's the neoconservative strand of the right wing. There's the national conservative strand, the nationalist wing, and there's the Trump wing. And I'm going to kind of go over where I think I fall within these different subgroups, within all these different ideologies and movements. And I think the perfect place to start is with the first book that I have here to talk about today, which is End the Fed by Ron Paul. This is a book I read a couple months back that was kind of my introduction to more right-wing libertarianism through reading. I had heard, of course, all these arguments on different podcasts and in debate clips. I watched old Ron Paul debate clips where he would talk about the Federal Reserve and the gold standard and all these different financial and economic things that seemed like only kooks would care about. But when you dive into the things that Ron Paul discusses in this book about the Federal Reserve specifically, you realize how central it is to pretty much everything else that we care about in America. And a lot of the things, like war, for example, it's central to that. And that you can't really discuss war fairly or accurately without discussing the impact that the Federal Reserve has on the state's ability to conduct war. So, in this book, Ron Paul goes through the entire origins of the Federal Reserve and essentially how it's a big conspiracy of the big banks to rig the system through artificially low interest rates, that the Federal Reserve lends the money to the banks with artificially low interest rates that the banks then lend out with very jacked up interest rates to make bigger profits than in a free market system they would. So, he also talks about how inflation is not some natural law of humanity. Inflation doesn't just happen naturally over time. It's in a large part results of government intervention into the economy. He talks about how inflation is one. He talks about different forms of taxation and how taxation isn't just only the direct taxation of the government taxing your money. It's also done through the government borrowing from other countries, taking loans out. The government borrowing money is essentially a promise to tax you in the future to pay back those loans. That's one form of taxation. And then, of course, we have direct taxation, like income tax, property tax, and all these other forms of taxation where the government essentially uses its monopoly on force to take your money through artificial labels of the IRS or tax collectors, labels that the government just gives itself to justify stealing your property. And the third is through printing money. That's the third form of taxation that's indirect. By printing money, they are inflating the supply of currency, therefore devaluing your currency, and in a sense, taxing your currency and giving it less value and taking value from your money. So these are all the things that Ron Paul discusses in his book, End the Fed, that showcase how the economic system is far from capitalist. He discusses a lot of things that the left will complain about the current economy, but then they talk about these problems and then use that to justify bigger state intervention into the economy. And he just basically smashes that whole thing, that whole ideology, that no, the problem is the state intervention into the economy. So that is Ron Paul's End the Fed. That's the first book to talk about today. The next is kind of in a similar realm. It is Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman. This was after I read Ron Paul's End the Fed. I wanted to learn more about kind of capitalism as a broad idea. And as someone who comes from a conservative background for years in my upbringing, I've just kind of had a more conservative lens. And so I just kind of automatically saw myself as a capitalist. But this is my first real deep dive into capitalism and why it is the best system to ensure freedom, both politically and economically. And Milton Friedman basically makes the argument in this book that you can't have political freedom without economic freedom. That is the big piece of this book and why it's called Capitalism and Freedom. Because without capitalism, without free markets, without the option to make voluntary transactions in the market, then you're reliant on the state to allow you to make these transactions, and that risks the state viewing your political views as reason to not allow you to make these economic transactions. So basically, what Milton Friedman discusses is how an essentially planned economy, an economy that is run by the state and not by free markets, then that creates the risk that the government will not allow you to make voluntary transactions based on your political views. And in a free market, your ability to make your own economic decisions is kind of the framework that allows you to expand into the political realm of thinking. Because if you're not economically stable, or your economic stability could be taken from you by the state at any time, then you're less willing to risk that in order to expand political thought or expand political discourse. So that is the gist of Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom. And I think it is, both of these guys, Ron Paul and Milton Friedman, would be considered different strands of libertarianism. I think they're actually pretty similar. Both would consider themselves minarchists, where they're not going full-blown anarchy. They don't believe in eliminating the state as an idea. They do think that the state is there to protect essentially life, liberty, and property, and it should be done through, of course, systems like police and the military. But they do believe in significantly reining back the state's reach and the state's power. So that is Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman. Now we will move on to the first foreign policy book that I'll be discussing here, and that is Hiroshima by John Hersey. So this book I picked up a couple months back, probably 8 months ago, and I just it was when I was starting through both Ukraine and the war going on in Israel in the Middle East, I was starting to get really into war as a philosophical matter and the differences between the more neoconservative right and the libertarian anti-war right. And this isn't an explicitly anti-war book, but the writing inside of it and the storytelling of the on-the-ground reality after the U.S. dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and, of course, Nagasaki, the writing in this book that describes that kind of speaks for itself in outlining through insane imagery the horrific, true human cost of the policies that the U.S. enacted against the people, against the civilian population of Hiroshima, Japan, and Nagasaki, Japan, to end World War II. And this was kind of the launch pad for my thinking that if let's just lay this out. If there is a morality, if you're out there and if we can all agree that there's an objective right and wrong, then that morality it just on principle fundamentally cannot shift from person to person or entity to entity. It can't shift if it's a person committing this act that we consider immoral, or it's the state or a politician committing the act that we consider immoral. So if you're a person, and I hear this scenario laid out a lot, so I think it's a very good one. If you're in a domestic situation, say there is a serial killer who runs and hides inside of a school, and in that school are a bunch of innocent children who happen to be in the vicinity of that serial killer. The sheriff shows up to the school, and instead of negotiating to get the serial killer out of the school, he just says, "All right, boys, blow up the school," killing innocent children who happen to be in the vicinity of the serial killer. Now, in no domestic scenario would we morally view that as justified, that the killing of all these innocent kids just because they're in the vicinity of a serial killer who's hiding in the school. We wouldn't view that as justified, and we would actually prosecute the sheriff who ordered the bombing of the school. Because in any consistent sense, that would be considered immoral to do that. Now, if we're talking about a state or a government doing that, morality can't just magically shapeshift to fit the likes of the state. If a state does the exact same thing internationally, like they did here in Hiroshima, in the name of calling it collateral damage, they blow up an entire city, hundreds of thousands of people, that didn't commit a crime, hundreds of thousands of innocent Japanese civilians who were just there living their life, then we can't be consistent unless we call that immoral as well. So, morality, the gist of what I got out of this. Then again, this isn't the case that John Hersey makes in Hiroshima. He's simply outlining the disgusting imagery of the days, weeks, and months and years of the aftermath. But morality, we have to view this as wrong if we're also to view a domestic situation like I just laid out as wrong, because morality and logic can't just shapeshift. So that is what I got out of Hiroshima. Highly, highly recommend. And the next book I want to discuss is more about the right wing broadly, and it is Pat Buchanan's Where the Right Went Wrong. This book, it's a recent read for me. I got this about a month or two ago. And in this book, he starts off by outlining the takeover of the Republican Party by the neocons, the neoconservatives, through the 70s, 80s, in the 90s, and then culminating in when this book was written in 2004 in the Bush administration, where essentially the entire foreign policy and State Department were infiltrated by neoconservatives who used the powers that they had acquired to pursue policies after 9/11 that they had wanted to pursue for decades prior to 9/11. And Pat Buchanan is trying to do justice to the Reagan Republican Party, which he feels, and he describes it in the book, he feels had been taken over and destroyed by the neocons. So you get a lot out of this book because it showcases this, as well as there's of course Ron Paul books about foreign policy as well. I have one right here behind me, Foreign Policy of Freedom, where Pat Buchanan and Ron Paul prove that you can still be on the right and have a non-interventionist foreign policy, which for someone on the right who is just overwhelmed by the propaganda, the war drums nonstop from the likes of Fox News, it's really good to see people like Ron Paul and Pat Buchanan, two legends of the right, just show that yes, you can still be a Republican or a conservative or someone from the right more broadly and also have a non-interventionist foreign policy, because Pat Buchanan lays out the America First case. It's kind of overwhelming that should therefore justify a non-interventionist foreign policy, because being truly America First means that we don't become an empire, because republics that become empires throughout history have proven to fall. And if we overextend ourselves too much, we do it at the expense of the American people. Ron Paul would say at the expense of our currency. And more broadly, both of them would kind of make the case that it's at the expense of the younger generations, that through the inflation of our currency would then be unable to afford things like housing, and the price of everyday goods goes up as a result of printing endless money to fund overseas wars that aren't in our interest anyways. So that's not even the case that Pat Buchanan makes. That's more of a Ron Paul argument. But Pat Buchanan makes the case for an America First foreign policy of non-intervention, and he does it from a right-wing perspective, which is just it's very interesting to hear a right-wing non-interventionist foreign policy. So I would highly recommend this for anyone who's interested in that field of thought. But next, our final book to get into is, in my opinion, the best one out of all of these, and it's the shortest one. It is Murray Rothbard's Anatomy of the State. And this book, I had read it a couple months back, just got the physical copy. I had read it online on Kindle, but I just got the physical copy because I just wanted to own it. It is just the most, it's the most insightful book on how to view the state. And it discusses the legitimacy of the state. Is the state inherently legitimate? And Rothbard would make the case that no, the state is not just inherently, they haven't received inherent legitimacy that they would claim they have. So he starts off by discussing what the state is and isn't, and he makes the overwhelming case that the state is not the people, and that they're two completely separate entities. And to prove this, he lays out what is seemingly a fairly obvious case, that Nazi Germany was not the Jews that they slaughtered. Because to say that the Jews and the Nazis in Nazi Germany were of the same entity would mean that the Jews would have had to have committed, that they would have had to been willingly walking into concentration camps, which is of course untrue. So by that standard, it's very clear that the state is not the people, because Nazi Germany did not represent the interests of the Jews that they would go on to kill. So he also makes the case of what the state is, and he describes it as essentially the biggest gang that has taken over an area and uses their monopoly on force to steal, to kidnap, and to murder, but does it all through the justification of they are the government, and that the government is a necessary force for human survival, essentially is what the case he's making. And if we look, and this goes back to what I was saying before, that if we have any standard for morality or logic, then of course it has to apply to the government as well as individuals, because it can't just shapeshift at the wishes of the government. Like if we look at things like taxation, for example, taxation on any individual level, if you went up and threatened someone on the streets to throw them in your basement if they didn't fork over 10% of their income. Now, on an individual standard, we would call that, if that ended up happening, if they gave you 10% of the income, we'd call that coercion or theft. Or if they refused and you kidnapped them, we would call that kidnapping. Now, for some reason, our standards seem to shapeshift whenever the state does it. If the state says you, for some reason, owe me 10% of your income, and if you don't give it to us, we're going to throw you in jail, then if our morality is to stay the same and not shapeshift based on if it's the state or an individual, then that is also kidnapping, theft, coercion. So that's one example. The other example, of course, goes back to war and how it doesn't change whether it's murder or not. If an innocent civilian is killed by a government or an individual, it has to all be the same if morality is even to mean anything, because it can't just shapeshift, again, as I was saying before. And it gets deeper. It's it's like 50 pages, but it's very dense in what it covers. And Rothbard also gets into how the state survives and how they convince the masses that essentially their rule is inevitable. They do this through guilt of you have a social contract, and therefore you are obligated to give 10% of your income. I'm saying 10%, but it's more than that in many cases. But you are obligated to give us a piece of your income because of the social contract. There's the fear in terms of foreign policy, that the fear that's heavy in the post-Iraq war era of the propaganda spewed by people like Dick Cheney of you have to be in fear of constant terror attacks, and then because of that fear justify us taking your liberties with the Patriot Act, using your tax dollars to go slaughter innocent civilians in Iraq because of that fear. He talks about all of that, and he even gets more in depth on the use of the state's use of intellectuals to justify their rule and their tyranny over the population. So it's very interesting. I would highly, if I could pick one book here to recommend to everyone, it would be Anatomy of the State by Murray Rothbard. So, in conclusion, all of these 5 books are the books that have inspired me to do this podcast and react to the news in the way that I do. And if I had to pick one of these to get everyone to at least start on, if I had to pick one book from this entire shelf, these 5, for you to start on to view the world like I do, it would be Anatomy of the State by Murray Rothbard. And it doesn't mean that you have to be as anarchist or as radical as Rothbard implies he is in this book. You could also be like a Milton Friedman and still say there is a role for the government in the world. It's just not in the extreme ways that they currently are operating. There are different strands of all this is essentially what I'm saying. That you don't have to subscribe to every idea of what one person says in one book. You can say that this person has incredible ideas and then also disagree with a couple of them. So at the end of the day, I encourage nuance. I encourage looking into all of this stuff. And I encourage everyone out there, with the news in general, just do your research, hear from different points of view, and whatever really makes the most sense to you. I think that's the way you ought to view the world, because through all the propaganda, once you hear the truth, you kind of know what the truth is. So that's, I think, where I'll end it off for today. Thank you guys so much for listening, and have a great day.
Americanism, not globalism.
I am not a slave. I am a free citizen.
There should be no Federal Reserve system.
Only America first.